Track 21.
My family isn't very big. There's just my son and me. I'm a single parent. For the last 10 years, I've been concentrating on looking after my son James, who's now 14. But now I've met someone special, and we've just got engaged. My fiancé has 4 kids of his own, and we're going to get married in July. James is really excited about it. He's looking forward to having brothers and sisters in his new step-family. We live as one big extended family. There are 7 of us in our household. Besides my husband and me and our children, there's my aunt and 2 of my cousins. I stay at home and care for my mother because she's quite old and can't look after herself. Obviously, we suffer from a lack of space in the house, but we all get on well.
Track 22. 1.
Firstly, I am going to talk about the role of the parent. Secondly, I'll discuss the role of the child. And lastly, we'll look at the family unit as a whole.
2.
Parenting is a difficult job because no 2 children are ever the same.
3.
Families are important because they form the basis for socialization. Additionally, they educate and protect the next generation.
4.
The family structure has varied greatly over time. That is, different times have had different views of what a traditional family structure is.
5.
Many argue that less traditional structures are not as effective. However, there is little evidence to support this.
6.
Many people are having families later in life. Consequently, the rise in the number of single people may only be temporary.
7.
Families in other parts of the world differ from the Western norm. For instance, in some cultures, having multiple husbands or wives is the norm.
8.
Although there are many arguments for trying to keep the traditional family structure strong, I feel the key issue is the economic necessity of having a normal family structure.
Track 23.
As we have seen, changes in the structure of the family are constantly occurring. Extended to nuclear, patrifocal to a more equal footing between the sexes, and dual parenting to single parenting. However, a recent phenomenon in the UK, which is changing the traditional family, is the increasing number of adults who continue to live with their parents until their 30s or sometimes even their 40s. The UK has traditionally been a society where offspring leave the family home in their late teens or early 20s to set up their own home and families. But in the last 25 years, this has decreased. Official statistics released by the Office of National Statistics show that today 10% of men in their early 30s still live with their parents. This compares with 5% of women in this age range. The reasons for this are complex and varied. It cannot be denied that some people are choosing to stay at home. Living with parents can be an easy option. Food is provided, heating and electricity are paid for, and rent, if any, is minimal. However, a third of those surveyed claimed they are living with their parents because it is too difficult to get on the property ladder. House prices in the last few decades have risen dramatically. Property is now 5 times the average annual salary, whereas it was only 3 times the average annual wage in the 1980s. This fact, coupled with high unemployment amongst young people, makes it virtually impossible for a single person to buy a home or even rent. The number of students going on to higher education has also been steadily increasing. Many of these students return home after finishing their studies as a result of the student debt they have accumulated. It can take many years to pay this off, and if the burden of rent or a mortgage is added to that, it can be just too much for a young adult's pocket. However, help is now at hand. The government is tackling some of the problems that cause people to remain with their parents with a new scheme, the Affordable Housing Scheme. This aims to help people part buy a house or flat by making housing more affordable for first-time buyers and possibly taking the strain away from elderly parents.
Track 24. The family is a topic which we will look at in great detail this term. For sociologists, the family is often seen as the beginning of socialization. Indeed, it is the seed of society itself. In recent decades, many old people have no longer been able to rely on their offspring for support, which was common 50 years ago. Many children are brought up by only one parent, something virtually unheard of before the 1960s. We can certainly say that during the last half-century, we have seen an enormous change in traditional family structures. The extended family lasted well into the early 1900s, and this kind of strong family unit was essential due to property ownership. Housing often was scarce, and it was necessary for people to live with parents and take over the property when their parents died. Of course, people still benefit from their family line. Still today, people generally inherit any money that their mother or father might have. In the UK, the last 50 years has also seen a decrease in the number of offspring parents have, whereas in the 1950s, only 10% of offspring were only children. This number has risen. Nowadays, this is the case for just over a third of children. Track 25. In Victorian times, the upper classes made up less than 3% of the entire population of Britain, yet this class held more than 90% of the country's wealth. This shows the massive gap there was between rich and poor, a gap which has shrunk considerably in the last century. Today, we're going to look at the wide differences in family life between rich and poor in Victorian times. Let's begin with the upper classes. The upper classes of the Victorian period were generally the nobility or the clergy. Most of their servants were very poorly paid, but were always accommodated within the homes of upper-class Victorian families, so they didn't have to pay for accommodation, food, and often clothing. The money which they did earn, they normally sent home to their families. Many Victorian servants came from the countryside, where the effects of the Industrial Revolution had resulted in job losses. Amongst these servants were cooks, housemaids, stable hands and butlers. The family would also employ a nanny, who, although employed by the family, was not traditionally seen as a servant. A nanny's primary role was to care for the children. She was responsible for teaching the children how to behave, looking after them when they were ill, and instilling discipline into them. Nannies did not, however, educate the children. Generally, children from wealthy families did not attend school outside the family home. Tutors would come to the house to do this, and although on occasion mothers taught their children to read and fathers gave their children some instruction in Latin, this was not a common occurrence. Now, the Victorian upper classes had the reputation of being quite cruel, but this wasn't always the case. They were also quite charitable. Ragged schools were set up with funding from the upper classes so that poor children could have some form of education. Additionally, most Victorian parents were very proud of their children, who were often seen as prized possessions. This goes against the common idea that parents were very hard on their children. In fact, the opposite was generally the rule. However, the situation for lower-class families was very different. In the lower classes, child labour was rife. Children, as young as 8, earned a living as chimney sweeps for wealthy houses. Now, let's move on to looking at the lower-class families in more detail. You'll find that very often. Track 26. Section 4. You will hear a lecture on changes in family structure. First, you will have 20 seconds to look at questions 1 to 10. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 10.
We are all familiar with the nuclear family, which has been the dominant family structure in the UK for the last 60 years at least. However, recent changes show that our idea of the traditional nuclear family as the cornerstone of British family life is changing. There have been emerging patterns which are eroding this structure, namely the rise of step families, cohabitation, lone parenting, and the rapid increase in those living alone. We are going to explore these areas in turn and look at their effect in terms of the family. Firstly, step families are becoming more and more common. Step families are created when one or both partners have a child or children from a previous relationship. In 1980, the percentage of children under 13 who were living with one parent and their new partner was just 4%. In 2008, this figure had increased to 20%. The USA has seen an even greater rise. New statistics show that almost half of under 13s are living in a step family. Now, we can still call the step family structure a nuclear family, as it does follow the structure of two parents and dependent children. However, it also creates somewhat of a nuclear blur. Step brothers and sisters may belong to two family units, so where do we draw the line at which family they belong to? Cohabitation, when partners do not marry yet live together as a family, has also increased. In 2006, of the 17.5 million families in Britain, nearly 3 million of these comprised unmarried couples. What does this mean to the nuclear family? Firstly, the traditional view of a nuclear family requires married parents, so we can't put these types of family under this umbrella. Statistics show that even if cohabiting couples have children, they are more likely to separate than their married equivalents. Lastly, we need to look at the rise of the DINKs, which stands for Dual Income, No Kids. As Clark and Henwood outline, many cohabiting couples are choosing a life without children, putting consumer spending first. Lone parenting is a relatively recent family structure which has rapidly grown in the last half-century. In 1972, only 1 in 14 children lived in a lone parent family. When we compare this with today's figure of 1 in 4, we can see that this is a rapid increase. In the past, lone parenthood was overwhelmingly the result of a death of a parent. Nowadays, however, it is increasingly a choice. Some sociologists argue that this increase is due to the outlook of women. Where women once were willing to accept an unhappy or abusive marriage, now many will choose lone parenthood. Often, this can be just a transitory phase before they find a new partner. This view of women's attitudes and lone parenting is highly debated because some figures show that the largest group of lone parents are mothers who have never married. You can find counter-arguments for these ideas in Butler and Jones. One difficulty for single parents is that they are a social group who are much more likely to suffer from poverty and hardship. They are more likely to live in rented accommodation and have childcare issues. Lastly, an increasing number of people are choosing to live alone. The number of people living alone in Britain has more than doubled in the last 20 years. In 1990, just over 4 million people lived alone. Now this figure has reached 8.5 million, an incredibly rapid growth which has had enormous effects on the traditional nuclear family. This number represents a great chunk of the population who, either by choice or necessity, are outside the traditional family unit. Some think that these changes may not help the community. In fact, there are many arguments that this rise in alternative household structures will create a more isolationist and less community-based society, where close bonds, which are usually formed within the family, have no place. Leaving aside whether or not the housing even exists for this boom, an important factor which must be looked at is the disproportionate expense for those living on their own. By this I mean the burden of all costs is shouldered by one wage instead of two, and of course one person is using the energy which could be shared between a group, having a greater impact on the environment too. However, on a more positive note, people, especially women, are proving to be extremely
That is the end of the listening test. In the exam, you will have half a minute to check your answers.